Why did a see-through blob that lives 2,000 feet underwater just solve one of the biggest engineering problems humans have been struggling with for decades? That's not a hypothetical question. Scientists at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute actually studied this creature and walked away genuinely stunned. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why engineers, climate scientists, and even tech companies are now paying close attention to something that looks, at first glance, like a floating piece of snot in the middle of the ocean. Stay with me here, because the deeper we go into this story, the more unbelievable it gets. The creature we're talking about is called the giant Larvacean. And I know that name does absolutely nothing to convey how remarkable this animal actually is. It sounds like something you'd find under a rock in your backyard. But the giant Larvacean, specifically the species Bathocordeus stygius, is one of the most architecturally sophisticated organisms on the entire planet. It's a tiny animal, usually only a few centimeters long, but it builds a structure around its body that can grow larger than a basketball, sometimes approaching a meter in diameter. And it builds this structure out of mucus. Its own mucus, every single day. Now before you click away, just hear me out, because this mucus house is not what you think it is. Here's what's actually happening. The Larvacean secretes this enormous balloon-like structure made of a complex mucopolysaccharide material. Inside this balloon are intricate internal chambers, passageways, and filters arranged in a configuration so precise and so optimized that scientists have compared it to a microfluidic device. You know, the kind of ultra-sophisticated filtering technology we use in medical diagnostics, water purification, and pharmaceutical manufacturing. Except the Larvacean builds its version in a matter of hours. It runs entirely on the energy the creature absorbs from food. It operates without any mechanical parts, and the whole system is completely biodegradable and self-replacing. When engineers design filtration systems, they spend years optimizing flow rates, pressure gradients, particle capture efficiency, and energy consumption. The Larvacean has already solved all of those problems simultaneously, and it's been doing it for hundreds of millions of years. Let's break down exactly how this works, because the engineering here is genuinely jaw-dropping. The mucus house has two distinct layers. The outer balloon is called the outer house, and it serves as a coarse pre-filter. Water and particles flow through this outer membrane, and larger debris gets trapped on the outside, while smaller particles pass through. Then there's the inner house, which is a far more complex structure nested inside the outer balloon. The inner house contains fine filters made of mucus strands arranged in overlapping patterns. These inner filters capture the tiny particles of food, mostly bacteria and phytoplankton, that the Larvacean wants to eat. Water that has been filtered through both layers is then drawn in by the rhythmic pumping motion of the Larvacean's tail, which beats continuously to create the pressure differential that drives the whole system. Think about what that means from an engineering standpoint. You have a two-stage filtration system with coarse and fine filter media, a built-in pump powered by biological motion, pressure regulation through the geometry of the internal chambers, and automatic self-cleaning through the degradation and replacement of the entire structure. No external power input required beyond what the animal itself generates. No maintenance crew, no replacement parts. The entire system is essentially autonomous. And here's where it gets even more interesting for human applications. The inner filter of the Larvacean is structured in a way that specifically avoids clogging. This is one of the biggest challenges in designing any kind of filtration system. When you run water through a filter, particles accumulate on the filter surface and eventually block the flow. Traditional engineering solutions to this problem involve backflushing, mechanical cleaning, chemical treatment, or simply replacing filter media regularly. All of these solutions require energy, materials, and maintenance. The Larvacean solves the clogging problem through a completely different mechanism. When its filters become saturated or clogged, the animal simply abandons the entire mucus house and secretes a brand new one. The whole process of building a new house takes only a few hours. This means the Larvacean is running a replacement strategy rather than a maintenance strategy, And because the old house is made entirely of organic material, it sinks to the ocean floor and becomes food for other organisms. Which brings us to the second reason scientists are so fascinated with these creatures. And this one has implications that go far beyond engineering. The giant Larvacean is a critical player in what oceanographers call the biological carbon pump. Here's how it works. The ocean absorbs enormous quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Phytoplankton in the surface layers use this carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, incorporating carbon into their bodies. When these phytoplankton die, or when they're eaten by zooplankton, or when particles of organic material clump together, they form what's called marine snow. This is a constant gentle fall of organic particles drifting down through the water column toward the seafloor. Marine snow is one of the primary mechanisms by which carbon gets sequestered in the deep ocean, locked away from the atmosphere for potentially thousands of years. Now, here's where the Larvacean comes in. Those abandoned mucus houses, the ones the Larvacean discards when they get clogged, don't just slowly drift downward as individual particles. They collapse into dense, mucus-rich packages full of trapped organic material, bacteria, phytoplankton cells, and everything else the outer filters captured, but the animal didn't eat. And because they're dense and compact, they sink fast, much faster than typical marine snow. Studies tracking the sinking rates of discarded Larvacean houses found that they can descend at rates that deliver carbon to the deep seafloor far more efficiently than individual particles would on their own. This means the giant Larvacean is essentially acting as a carbon packaging and delivery service for the deep ocean. It captures surface carbon, concentrates it, and then fires it toward the seafloor in compact bundles. Scientists have calculated that in regions where Larvaceans are abundant, these discarded houses can account for a substantial fraction of the total carbon flux to the deep ocean. If you want to understand the ocean's role in regulating atmospheric carbon dioxide, you cannot ignore what Larvaceans are doing. Now let's talk about the technology angle, because this is where things get really exciting for the near future. Researchers at MBARI used remotely operated vehicles equipped with specialized lighting systems to study giant Larvaceans in their natural habitat without disturbing or destroying the fragile mucus structures. One of the key tools they developed was a device called Deep PIV, which stands for Deep Particle Image Velocimetry. This instrument uses laser light sheets to illuminate tiny particles in the water and track their movement, allowing scientists to map the exact flow patterns through the Larvacean's mucus house in 3 dimensions. What they found when they mapped these flow patterns was extraordinary. The internal geometry of the Larvacean's house creates optimized flow pathways that maximize the contact between water and filter surfaces while minimizing the energy required to push water through the system. The design is so efficient that it actually outperforms many engineered microfluidic systems by several measures. Now, engineers and materials scientists are asking a very direct question. Can we reverse engineer what the Larvacean does? Can we take the principles of its architecture and translate them into manufactured filtration systems? The potential applications are enormous. Water purification is one of the most pressing global challenges. Roughly 2 billion people still lack reliable access to safe drinking water. Current filtration technologies, while effective, are expensive, energy-intensive, and require ongoing maintenance that is difficult to sustain in remote or resource-limited environments. A filtration system inspired by Larvacean architecture could potentially deliver high efficiency at low energy cost with minimal maintenance requirements. That's not a science fiction scenario. That's a legitimate engineering target that multiple research groups are now working toward. Medical diagnostics is another area. Microfluidic devices are used to separate and concentrate biological particles, isolate specific cell types, or filter out contaminants from clinical samples. The Larvacean's inner filtration architecture offers new geometric and material inspiration for designing these devices. There's also potential in air filtration, in industrial process filtration, and in any application where you need to separate particles of different sizes from a flowing medium. But let me take a step back here and address something that I think makes this whole story even more profound. Because this isn't just about what humans can borrow from the Larvacean. It's about what the Larvacean's existence tells us about the ocean environment we're changing. The giant Larvacean lives in what scientists call the mesopelagic zone and deeper. This is the twilight zone of the ocean, from about 200 meters down to around 1,000 meters, and the bathypelagic zone below that. These regions of the ocean are some of the least explored environments on Earth. We know more about the surface of Mars than we know about the deep ocean floor. The creatures that live here have evolved in conditions of crushing pressure, near total darkness, and scarce food over timescales that dwarf human civilization. Their adaptations are not random. They are the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary pressure, ruthlessly selecting for efficiency, reliability, and resource optimization. When we find something in the deep ocean that is this well engineered, we should pay attention, not just because it might be useful to us, but because it suggests there are thousands of other organisms in the deep ocean with equally remarkable capabilities that we haven't discovered yet. And here's the uncomfortable part. Many of those organisms may be disappearing before we ever get the chance to study them. Deep sea mining is accelerating. Commercial interests are targeting polymetallic nodule fields in regions like the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in the Pacific, which happens to overlap with habitats where organisms like Larvaceans live, and where their discarded houses contribute to seafloor carbon deposition. The effects of deep sea mining on these ecosystems are poorly understood, and the timescales for ecosystem recovery in the deep ocean, if recovery is even possible, are thought to be extraordinarily long. We are talking about potentially disrupting ecosystems that are actively involved in regulating Earth's carbon cycle before we even fully understand how they work. There's also the question of ocean warming. As surface temperatures rise and oxygen levels in the ocean change, the distribution of organisms like Larvaceans may shift. Since Larvaceans play a key role in the biological carbon pump, changes in their distribution or abundance could have feedback effects on how much carbon the ocean is able to absorb. This is the kind of detail that gets lost in high-level climate discussions, but it matters enormously for the accuracy of our climate projections. Let's come back to the sheer biological wonder of this creature for a moment, because I don't want the technical details to make you lose sight of just how strange and beautiful the giant Larvacean actually is. Imagine you are 2,000 feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. It is completely dark. The pressure is more than 60 times what it is at the surface. There is very little food. And yet, suspended in this darkness, there is a creature the size of your thumb that has built itself a palace. A transparent, glowing palace of mucus that fills the water around it like an architectural sculpture. The animal sits at the center of this structure, its tail beating in a steady rhythm, pulling water through chambers and corridors that it designed and built from scratch in a single night. Every few days, it walks away from this palace and builds a new one. The old one collapses, sinks, and feeds an entirely different community of organisms on the seafloor hundreds of meters below. This has been happening, continuously, in every ocean on Earth, for hundreds of millions of years. Long before the first fish, long before the first land plant. In some form or another, organisms like this have been pumping carbon to the bottom of the sea since before complex life as we know it existed. That is almost impossible to fully wrap your mind around. And yet, most people have never heard of the giant Larvacean. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't go viral on social media. It doesn't get a nature documentary the way great white sharks or blue whales do. It's a centimeter-long, gelatinous animal in the dark, doing something so subtle and so essential that we are only now beginning to understand its importance. This is why deep sea exploration matters so much. Not because there might be monsters down there, though honestly, some of the creatures we find are pretty monstrous. Not because there might be valuable minerals, though there are, but because the deep ocean is a library of evolutionary solutions to problems that humanity is actively struggling to solve. Filtration, carbon capture, energy efficiency, self-healing materials. We are spending billions of dollars trying to engineer solutions to these challenges in laboratories, and the ocean has already solved many of them, elegantly, sustainably, and at scales we can barely imagine. The giant Larvacean is one page in that library, one extraordinary, humbling page. So what do we do with this information? First, we need to fund deep sea research at levels that match the importance of what's down there. MBARI and institutions like it are doing incredible work, but they are underfunded relative to the significance of the questions they are answering. Second, we need to take seriously the regulatory frameworks around deep sea mining and other anthropogenic impacts on the deep ocean. You cannot exploit an ecosystem you don't understand, not without risking consequences that could dwarf the economic value of whatever you extract. Third, and maybe most importantly for you watching this right now, we need to tell these stories. Because public awareness drives funding decisions, policy decisions, and cultural priorities. If more people know that there is a tiny animal in the deep ocean that has solved some of engineering's hardest problems while simultaneously sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, maybe more people will care about protecting the world that animal lives in. The deep ocean still holds more mysteries than answers. But every time we send a vehicle down into that darkness and come back with footage of something like the giant Larvacean doing something we never imagined possible, it becomes a little clearer that the abyss is not empty. It is full of solutions, full of stories, and full of reasons to keep looking.